Okay, so we're going to get started. This is the third week of these classes, but I've organized the class in such a way that even if it's your first time, and we have a bunch of first timers here, you will be able to follow. If you do want to go back, the first two recordings will be available on the Jewish Park City Facebook group in the coming days. Tonight's class, like every week's class, is we're all studying in the merit of the recovery of our friend Aviva Galia Basima, and it's a tradition that when we study in the merit of something, and all of our studying all winter long is in the merit of a continuing recovery for Aviva Galia Basima. I just wanted to thank the audio-visual committee. We've got now two devices recording this. We've got a Teams meeting with Stanton joining us, and then the recording that'll be up on the Jewish Park City Facebook page. Thanks to the refreshment committee, we've got lots of kosher refreshments, as you could hear people chomping away. And then I want to thank the author of this book, Rabbi Benjamin Blech, Understanding Judaism, the Basics of Deed and Creed, which is the basis for this course. I was a student of Rabbi Blech back at Yeshiva University while he was writing the book. And the book came out after I graduated, and it was the first book that I read, and I'm like, oh, I know that already. So that was kind of cool. In the first week, I'm just going to go through the first 2 weeks very quickly. In the first week, we gave a little bit of context for the book, and that is that Rabbi Blech was teaching at Yeshiva University in the 90s, and there was a recognition that there were lots of people coming back to their faith, just as there are today in the aftermath of October 7th. So many people are getting more connected to their Judaism and to Israel. After the Holocaust, people started questioning, how could there be a God? But in the years and decades following it, people started returning to Judaism in unprecedented numbers. And at Yeshiva University, there were students that were coming in with very little background, and they couldn't be taught the same way the other students were who had been in a Jewish school for their entire childhood and had this very long background that taught them some of the fundamentals of the faith. And so what Rabbi Blech was tasked to do was to write a book that had never been written before, which is if you are coming to Judaism later in life and you don't have that background of hour after hour, year after year of studying, you can't really make up for that, but let's try. And he does that here in this book beautifully, and it's very well organized, and it's very text-based. So the main point of our first class was that all of the commandments, all of the mitzvot are created equal. There are no big ones and no little ones. And what I like about the book and the class, the course, is that it's a myth-busting book. And it's not just busting myths, it's actually coming from sources. And last week, in the second week, we did a little bit of an overview of some of those different sources. They were the Mishnah, which is the oral law that had never been written down until around the year 300 of the Common Era, when Jews were being persecuted, and there was a fear that this oral tradition would be lost. The idea is that, as we'll get into in today's class, that Moses the Bible was transmitted, the Torah was transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai, and that's what our Torah is in writing. But there were a lot more intricacies that were passed down to Moses in the oral law and the oral tradition. And that was kept orally for a very long time until it was at risk of being lost. And it was a very controversial decision at the time to actually write it down because it wasn't supposed to be written down. But now we have that, and that's called the Mishnah. The Mishnah was really written in shorthand. So in later generations, they wanted to understand, well, what did that Mishnah mean? Like, we got this from Moses, and now we wrote it down, but it's shorthand. And that is what became the Talmud, the Gemara. The Talmud is all of these arguments about what the Mishnah really meant and different interpretations of it. And it wasn't just rabbis coming up with their own ideas of what was right. It was that their tradition, their family had heard it from Moses way back then, and this is how we interpret the law based on our tradition going back to my father, my father's father, etc. And like a game of telephone, sometimes there are debates over what was actually said. And that's what the Talmud is, but it's also pretty densely written. And last week we discussed something called the Midrash, which are kind of analogous to the Mishnah, but it's more of a storytelling style of how we interpret the events of the Torah. And then we got down to a more practical level. There's the Shulchan Aruch, which is the code of Jewish law, which is no longer arguing what the Mishnah meant. It's just, here's the law as we understand it. So if you wanted to know the law, you can go to the Mishnah and try to figure out what it meant. You can go to the Talmud and see multiple arguments of if yes or no, it meant this or that. Or you can just go to the code of Jewish law for a practical decision. We also discussed Jewish preachers, all the parables that were given. We talked about the Maggid of Dubno. Maggid is like a storyteller, and they had parables that helped explain some interesting points. And then one of the devices that we got into was something called gematria. And gematria is numerics. So if A is 1, B is 2, 3 is C, etc., Aleph, Beis, Gimel, 1, 2, 3. And these numerics are, there are often hidden ideas in the words, and the Hebrew words and letters are unique from any other alphabet or language, and that is that the words themselves and the letters of themselves are infused with meaning, and they mean the essence of the word. And we'll get into some more of that today. So until now, we've been really honing in on the idea that all the mitzvos are created equal. We learned in the first week that the hardest mitzvah, the hardest commandment, honoring your parents, and what is considered the easiest mitzvah, which is sending away the mother bird when you take the egg. All you have to do is flip your wrist. The easiest and the hardest of the commandments are both equal. They have the same reward, and therefore everything in between. All of the 613 commandments that we have to assume that they're all equal, that there's no big mitzvah or big sin, or little mitzvah or little sin. They are all the commandments of God, and it's not up to us to decide which one is important and which is not. And in the second chapter, we got into the idea that if you're currently engaged in a commandment of God, you're busy doing it, and then it becomes time to do another commandment, not only don't you have to stop what you're doing, you're not allowed to stop what you're doing. If you're doing a commandment now, and there's another opportunity for a commandment, you have to complete the commandment that you're doing. You can't just say, oh, that new one is more important. And we joked with people like me with ADD, we want to always go on to the next one. The idea is this one, the one that you're with now, is most important, and you have to complete doing it before you stop. And that brings us to week 3, where we're going to discuss the 10 Commandments. I'm going to start with a quote from one of my favorite professors, Richard Feynman, the physicist. And he says, the problem is not people being uneducated. The problem is that people are educated just enough to believe what they've been taught and are not educated enough to question anything from what they've been taught. And I think that's a problem that we have. And I've been talking in previous classes that I was always taught, this is a big mitzvah. Oh, that's a sin, but it's not a big sin. All wrong. We were not taught to question these things. So I want to see if anyone has a question based on the 10 Commandments. Does anyone want to give me like what are the 10 Commandments? Like, what do you think they are? Anybody want to chime in? Jody.
Respecting each other.
Respecting each other. So that's certainly one of the ideas within the 10 Commandments. But as a category, like, the Torah is a book that we got from God, which has the laws in it. So I'm looking at a book over here, calculus. I don't even know what calculus is, but you could define calculus, right? What are the 10 Commandments as a category?
The commandments between man and God.
So there are 2 types of categories between man and man and God, and that's correct. But to me, if you've been paying attention to the first 2 weeks, the only idea that we've been focusing on is that all the commandments are equal. Okay, well now we're going to learn about the 10 Commandments. You don't have to be a rabbi, or you don't have to have gone to Jewish day school for your whole life to understand that there's an inherent conflict there. That we've been studying that all the laws are equal. They're all the same. We don't do one before the other. There aren't big ones, there aren't little ones. And now we're going to study the 10 Commandments, the 10 big mitzvot. So what's the question?
What happened to the other 603?
Right, there's 613 commandments. And as we'll get into here in the text, that these 10 commandments were written on 2 tablets. They were handed to Moses. They were kept in the holiest place of the tabernacle and the Mishkan. We got them directly from God. Obviously, if God chose these 10 for special treatment, he himself made a choice. It would appear that they are the most important laws of Judaism. Doesn't the existence of the 10 commandments, or a Decalogue, doesn't the existence of these 10 commandments refute our claim regarding what he calls the constitutional principle of equality of mitzvot? And what we're going to learn tonight is no, it is not a contradiction. Even though, based on what we all know, that the 10 commandments are these 10 important commandments between man and man and God, and that they were, we don't have the 12 commandments, we've got the 10 commandments. Everybody knows the 10 commandments. So they're obviously special. Question is, how do you square that with the idea that all the commandments are equal? And in really a brilliant chapter here, we're actually going to learn that it doesn't undermine the idea, if you learn it properly, it doesn't undermine the idea that all the commandments are equal. It's actually a proof of the idea that all of the commandments are equal, but only when you understand what the 10 commandments are, or perhaps more importantly, that there are no 10 commandments, that we have been taught it wrong, that our understanding of the 10 commandments is actually the Christian understanding and not the Jewish understanding. So that's why I think tonight's class is so exciting and so fun, is because we're going to break that myth of the 10 commandments, which are, I always thought they're the 10 most important commandments. I mean, it's a reasonable conclusion because these are the ones that God singled out to put on the tablets, and it's the one we talk about all the time. After going through this text, we'll understand that no, they aren't. First of all, there aren't 10 commandments, and they aren't the most important laws. So he begins by saying, let us begin clarifying what really occurred at Sinai. Did the Jewish people hear 10 commandments from God himself? The answer, interestingly enough, is no. And he says that the text does not introduce an interruption in the flow of the narrative, but the commentators explain that chapter 20, verse 16, which says, and they said to Moses, you speak with us, and we will hear, but do not let God speak with us, lest we die. That occurred immediately after the second commandment. Basically, and this is text, basically what the Jews were saying is, that was too much. Like, for a human to hear God's voice, or it was just too much. They were being blown away. And what if we as mere humans are not able to keep all of these 10 commandments? It's better that I not hear it directly from God himself. So Moses, why don't you communicate them to us? But we know that the first 2 of the commandments were from God himself, and the other 8 were given by Moses because the Jewish people said, I don't want to hear it, it's too much, we might die if the power of that voice is too much for us, and we may transgress. We'd rather not transgress if we hear it straight from God. But now we're going to get into some of the learning. We talked about the Talmud and the Mishnah. We're going to do a little bit of gematria. It's going to come up twice. Gematria, again, is that numeric value. And I was always a bit of a skeptic of gematria. It's kind of cute. It's kind of fun. It's not being meant to prove anything. And as we're going to do in next week's class, I know this is the exciting class, but next week's class is cool. Next week's class is cool because it's going to talk about miracles in the Jewish view of miracles and what we can and what we can't learn from them. So next week is also going to be a fun class, but ADD, I always want to go to the next topic. But in today's topic, we're going to do some fun gematria. So if anyone's good at math or has their calculator out, I'm going to need some help. So we talked about the Talmud. There are actually 2 Talmuds. There's the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. They were written similar times, same idea, but we didn't have the WhatsApp back then, so they couldn't be sharing it with each other. So the scholars in the Babylonian area and the people in the Jerusalem area had their own interpretations and their own book. Surprisingly pretty similar, but there are important differences. So we'll always distinguish between the 2. So in the Babylonian Talmud, it teaches us that there were a total of 613 mitzvos. 613 commandments. And we talked a little bit about this in the first two classes, that there are different interpretations of how they add up. This may be two separate commandments. This is a negative commandment, but it's actually two topics. And there are books that are written to explain which are the 613. But we all agree there are 613, but because we're Jewish, we can argue over which one is a mitzvah, which one is two. But there's an agreement, if anything, that there are 613. So he writes, being sensitive to the gematria, the numerology, the secrets of numbers hidden in letters of words, the Talmud notes the strange fact that the word Torah, which is the Bible, does anybody want to guess what Torah would add up to? The Torah, which teaches us the 613 mitzvos?
613.
613. I mean, right? If the word means the essence. So let's do the math. The first letter is the Tuf, which is 400. The second letter, the Vav, is 6. The Resh is 200. Is anyone keeping track?
Yeah.
And the Hey is the fifth letter, 5.
611.
611.
Oh, Susan.
Dun, dun, dun.
How can that be? Because we all agree there are 613 commandments. Now, Susan, you were in shul to me, and we were singing a pretty well-known song that talk about the commandments. Do you remember what that thing that we read every week is?
Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe.
Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe. Right? The Torah was commanded to us through Moshe. Okay, remember that. Torah was commanded through Moshe. And then, why would the word Torah be defective in number, indicating that Moses only taught us 611 laws rather than 613? The answer is, going back to what we just learned, the first two commandments were given to us directly from God. First two of the 10. Those two that Jody pointed out are between, or the first 5 that are between man and God, or woman and God. Those first 5 are between God and man, and then the next 5 are how we treat each other, like don't murder. But the first 2 of those first 5 were transmitted directly from God. We heard them, our ancestors heard them from God himself, and then we realized that's too much. And Moses came in and said, okay, I'll tell you what the other 8 are, because it's too much for you to hear all of them. But Torah, Tziva Lanu Moshe, 611 were given to us by Moses. And the only reason that makes sense and is true is because the first 2 were given directly from God. And Moses gave us the 611, the Torah. So there's more. You could just look at the text, and this is classic Jewish learning. The medieval commentator, Rabbi Avraham Ibn Ezra, makes the observation just by looking at the grammar. In the first and second commandments, God speaks in the first person, right? It says, I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. But when you get to the third commandment, however, the text switches from the second to the third person. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, because in 6 days, the Lord, not I your Lord, the Lord made heaven and earth. So just by reading the text, you can see that the first 2 commandments were spoken by God, I am the Lord, and then the rest, after the first 2, were given by Moses, 611 more. We're also going to cite the Jerusalem Talmud. It finds an allusion to this in the declaration of faith every Jew makes twice daily. I know it's something that we've talked about in the previous classes, is that we say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. It's one of our primary prayers. In this phrase, we proclaim not only that we believe, but why we believe. We know there is a God who gave us the Torah. We talked in the first class about there can't be commandments without a commander. We know there is a God who gave us the Torah because we heard him speaking to us. We were present at Sinai and God addressed us. So Shema Yisrael, continue to hear, O Israel, what you heard then. What did we hear? Hashem Elokeinu, the Lord is our God. The summary of the first commandment. And Hashem Echad, the Lord is one, which is the second commandment, is you shall have no other gods before me. Commandments 1 and 2 are in a class by themselves. They are the ones alluded to in the line of the Shema because they are the two laws that we in fact heard from him without the need for Moses as an intermediary. So by looking at the text and seeing the grammar, we can see that the first two were said by God and the rest were Moses. By understanding the Shema, it helps our understanding of it. The Babylonian Talmud uses gematria. And the fourth piece of evidence for that is another fascinating piece of gematria, of numerics. The first word of the Torah, anybody? Bereshit, which means in the beginning. It alludes to the two most fundamental principles of our faith. The middle letter of Bereshit is the shin, which appears on every mezuzah, is that big shin, and that stands for the name of God, Shaddai. Surrounding the shin are the letters Yud and Taf on one side, and Aleph and Resh on the other, and then at the beginning, the Beit, the B sound, is the first letter in the Torah and the second word in our alphabet, and that therefore is 2. So the total, Tav being 400, Resh 200, Yud 10, Aleph 1, and Beit 2, 613. And he writes, God and Torah meet in the very first word of the Torah. The word Bereshit is divided in a manner whereby the consonants Tav, Resh, Yud, and Aleph total 611, and they're supplemented by the enlarged Beit, which has a value of 2. Why was the Beit enlarged? Perhaps to intimate that the 613 commandments may be divided into 2 categories. 611 that were taught by Moses, and 2 that came directly from God himself. So at this point, if one were to repeat the question, did God recite all the 10 commandments? Now we can answer confidently, no. But that's not the end of the story. The introductory verse to the 10 commandments reads as follows, and God spoke all of these words saying. Rashi, quoted the Midrash, finds the source for an additional aspect of this story. And there's a phrase that says, God spoke all of these words, suggesting that before he gave the 10 commandments, 2 to us and 8 to Moses, there was an utterance that God uttered all simultaneously in one oral expression. If one were to imagine, it would be similar to a cacophony of sound, as if 172 people were each instructed at one time in the same moment to shout out a different word. God, of course, had no problem producing so many sounds at precisely the same moment. Does anyone remember the number 172? We talked about that before. There are 172 words in the 10 Commandments. So the Midrash doesn't tell us why God spoke all of these 172 words at once. Rashi, the Midrash tell us. But then, it begs the question, are these really the 10 most important laws of Judaism? Where's Yom Kippur? Right? We talked about if you had one day to keep Jewish law, many of us thought it would be Yom Kippur. Where is kashrus? Where are the kosher food laws or family purity? Not one of the sages suggests that the contemporary mind so often assumes. Right? Many people will assume, well, I may not keep all of the laws, but I keep the big ones, right? Those 10 commandments. So here's where we're going to get to the shocking statement of the book, or of the chapter, is that the whole idea of 10 commandments is a myth. Rabbi Blech writes, there are no 10 commandments. Pretty shocking. As shocking as that statement may seem, it becomes obvious once we examine the Hebrew terminology. A commandment is a mitzvah, right? There are 613 commandments. In Hebrew, we refer to the Taryag mitzvos, those 613 commandments. However, there is no equivalent phrase in all of Jewish tradition that refers to the 10 commandments. That would be the Aseret HaMitzvot, the 10 mitzvot. I've never read that. Clearly, one cannot speak of the 10 mitzvot because that would simply imply the selection by God of 10 commandments for special status, which is contrary to the whole idea of all mitzvot being created equal. Instead, we don't refer to the 10 mitzvot, the 10 commandments, we refer to them as the Aseret HaDibrot. Dibrot, Dibrot is
Speak.
daber, right? God spoke to Moses saying, daber. The word daber means speak. So Aseret HaDibrot are the 10 speakings or the 10 utterances. So Rabbi Saadia Gaon, who lived from 882 to 942 of the Common Era, clarified what this means. In a remarkable little book called Sefer Azharot, he shows the link between each one of the 613 mitzvos and its prime category heading. Every one of the 10 sayings, the Aseret HaDibrot, is in fact a major category or principle. And Jody alluded to this before, is that if you have a commandment, I'll give you an example straight from the book. So one of the commandments is, thou shalt not murder, right? Okay, so now I know, that's a big one, right? But the idea of all 613 commandments fitting in to one of those 10 categories would be illustrated this way. Embarrassing another person. So Jody said, how you treat other people? And I would argue that in the commandment that says, thou shalt not murder, it encompasses a whole lot of other commandments, especially with regard to how we treat other people. So here it says, embarrassing someone in public is a sin. But where is it found in the 10 principles? It is included in the laws forbidding murder, which in Hebrew is called shefichat damim, or shedding of the blood. When one person kills another, the victim has not been allowed to continue living. When someone embarrasses another publicly, the humiliated party wishes he or she were dead and might even have had preferred physical extinction to public shame. The Talmud teaches that when a person shames another publicly, God makes the blood rush from the latter's face. That too is a way of shedding blood, and it is viewed as a derivative of the sixth category or principle, or sixth commandment, as we used to call it until tonight. Thou shalt not murder. There's maximurder and mini-murder, and they are both equally forbidden. So I was taught in grade school a lot of stuff that wasn't true, but I was always taught, don't embarrass your classmate. That's as if you were killing them. And in fact, in terms of the categories, embarrassing someone falls under the category of killing. It's a mini killing, but it's still part of that principle. And if we look at the 10 commandments, which aren't commandments, they're utterances, if we looked at those 10 and we took it on as a project, as this author, Rabbi Saadia Gaon, did, is you could fit each of the 613 commandments, or the 603, in their category. We could sort them all out. And another example given in the book, where's Yom Kippur? Where's Passover? Sukkot, Shavuos. Principle number 4 teaches us that God may be captured not only in space, but in time. In Judaism, time is holy. The Sabbath day is to be used to reflect upon God both as a creator and architect of history. Once we accept this concept on a weekly basis, we may readily grasp the need to develop and extend it in such a way that all significant dates with major incidents of the past are to be celebrated on an annual basis. So the idea that we celebrate Passover in the same season each year, the same time, all fits in with the idea is we keep the Sabbath. That tells us that we keep the time, that we keep important moments in time. And all of the Jewish holidays that come out at a certain time are subcategories of you keep the Sabbath. In other words, you keep the time and celebrate the things that are important in question.
Wouldn't it say, isn't that why when you say the prayer of each day of the week, it says Ayom Yom B'Shabbat, so it's in the week.
Today is the first day of the Shabbat. Today is the second day of the Shabbat. It goes to the idea that even when it's not Shabbat, time is important, and we're not saying today is Sunday. We're saying today is the first day after Shabbat. Today is the second day after Shabbat. I was always taught that on Friday, before Shabbat, It's a very big mitzvah, although now we know there are no such things as big mitzvahs, but it is a mitzvah on Friday to prepare for the Sabbath. If I'm teaching a class on Saturday and I prepare for it on Thursday, then I'm getting the reward of studying, but I'm also observing the Sabbath before the Sabbath. And it's important. In Manhattan on the Upper West Side, many of you know I have a backyard with a terrace and a sukkah. I have one of the larger sukkahs on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And people would come and say, oh, look at these plants, look how beautiful it is. So the holiday of Sukkot falls out in September, late September, early October usually. And in April and May, when I am planting my garden, I think, where's the sukkah going to be? Where are these plants going to be in September or October? And I plant my garden with the intent of beautifying my sukkah. So even in April, as long as I have the intent, I am observing Sukkot in April and May. Now, if I just planted the garden and then put the sukkah up, that wouldn't be anything. But if I said, oh, the sukkah's going to be here, where do I want my plants to make the sukkah more beautiful? That would count. Question.
Can you explain what a sukkah is?
A sukkah is a hut that we are commanded to live in during a period of time that commemorates or symbolizes when the Jews were being protected, when they were out in the desert. God was still protecting them with a sukkah, which was actually clouds, but those clouds were a temporary shelter. And the sukkah is a temporary shelter. It temporarily, it's at the very end of the high holidays, so we've just been on the high of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and the holidays are coming to an end. And the one important law of a sukkah is that it doesn't have to have 4 walls. It has to have 2 and a little bit more than half of a wall. So it is an enclosure, but doesn't have to be a complete enclosure. And the idea is we're leaving God from these high holidays. We're going back to the regular year. And the sukkah almost acts like a hug, that we're being protected by God for that last time as we kind of end the high holidays. So these 10 utterances are not commandments, but principles. Not 10 mitzvos, but 10 categories. I think he gets a little bit too cute here with the numerology, but I'm going to play along. It's easier math, at least. How many mitzvos are there? 613. So let's play a math game. Add up all of those numbers. 6 plus 1 plus 3? 10. I don't know. This is so because all 613 may be reduced to a more fundamental grouping. That grouping is in fact the Aseret HaDibros, uttered at Sinai. It would be wrong to say God singled out 10 laws, thereby suggesting they were of greater importance. The 10, in fact, encompass the 613. So when you say these 10 are important, yes, they're important because all of the other ones fit into those categories. So there's a little bit of Talmud learning. The Talmud long ago addressed the problem of those who thought that the 10 Commandments were selected as the 10 most important laws of Judaism. I always thought they were, like why else would they be singled out? So he raises an interesting question. Susan and I were just talking about something that we say that Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe, that Moshe commanded us. We talk about in the daily prayer, we say the Shema. We read at the very beginning of the prayers the sacrifice of Yitzchak when it was a big test and Abraham was being asked to slaughter his only son. So we say all of these things. We read portions from the Torah. We read portions from the Mishnah. We read ideas from the Gemara. We read all of these things. Isn't it a little bit strange that we don't read the 10 Commandments in our prayers? Like even if they are not the 10 Commandments, even if they're the 10 utterances, but if these are the 10 categories of everything we should do, don't you think it would have been natural to include it in our daily prayers to remind us of that, given that our daily prayers have so many different readings that are spread throughout the daily prayer? So it's an interesting story about why we don't. It was once the case that we read them. But it's important first to understand what prayer is. I'm going to read some of it from him. Prayer today is an attempt to create a substitute for the sacrificial system practiced in the Holy Temple of Jerusalem. So it used to be that we would give sacrifices of certain animals and certain herbs, some certain scent smells, and there was an order to it. And the Hebrew word for sacrifice is karban. And the root of that word is kariv. What does kariv mean? To bring close. So it's hard for us to understand sacrifices in the temple in ancient times, but to know what the word of a sacrifice is, the root of that word, the essence of the sacrifice, is to bring us closer to God. I'm not going to ask you to understand it. I have a hard time understanding it. But now, just know that the idea of it was to bring us closer to God. And I can understand that if you give something of value to someone, it may make you feel closer to them. But we don't have the temple anymore, and we don't have that opportunity to give sacrifices. In fact, if you tried to give a sacrifice today, not only would you probably get arrested by the animal control police, animal cruelty police, but it's a violation of the law. It has to be done according to the prescribed way in the temple. And we don't have the temple anymore. So how do we feel close to God? The prayers were instituted. So we didn't have the prayers before. We had a few sayings that they would say before the karban, before the sacrifice. But prayers are instituted as a replacement for those sacrifices. In spite of all this, the Talmud tells us that even in the days of the temple, there were some prayers so basic to an understanding of our relationship with God that they were recited by the Kohanim, the priests, as part of the sacrifice. One of these prayers at a time when institutional liturgy, as we know it, was almost non-existent, was the recitation of the Aseret HaDibros. What made such a basic part of prayer disappear from our own liturgy? The answer revolves around a rabbinic response to an unfortunate misunderstanding. We learned in the first class that it's very important to understand the words of the sages very carefully, because if we misinterpret them, we may get something totally wrong. The reward for honoring your parents and the reward for sending away the mother bird is a long life. And then there was a story that was told where someone saw a father told the son, go get that egg. The son dutifully went to go get the eggs, sent away the mother bird, and as he was climbing down the tree, he fell and he died. And the person who witnessed this said, the whole thing is a fraud. I was told long life if you honor your parents and if you send away the mother bird. This guy did both of them in the same minute, and then immediately after that he died. The whole thing's a fraud. Well, the idea of a long life is really an eternal long life, because how could God promise a long life if we're human and there is no such thing as that long of a life? It really means an eternal long life. So it's important that we understand the words of the sages very carefully. So he says, the rabbis negated the daily recitation of the Ten Commandments because of the libels of the heretics. In the current edition of the Talmud, Rashi's explanation of the words heretics is rendered as akum, idolaters. Earlier uncensored versions have Rashi in a more relevant version, Talmidei Yeshu, disciples of Jesus. Christians burned the Talmud numerous times and imposed censorship of what they called offensive passages, which led to a self-protective self-censorship, the correct edition of the Talmud. What we have here is, in fact, an early reference to Christianity and the early Judeo-Christians. It was they, with an eye on spreading their religion and making it far more appealing, who claimed that if God wrote these 10 tablets, these 10 on the tablets, they and they alone must be the most important laws of Judaism. That's why I said earlier, it's the Christian understanding that the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, the Christians understand them fairly enough to be the 10 most important laws. And they would believe that more is really not required, right? According to the Christians, as long as you believe in Jesus, you're saved. We talked a little bit about that in the opening, before the opening chapter. It would be an easy step from here to say, I am religious because I observe these 10. For us, however, the 10 are but a summary of the 613, and if one chose to select merely 10 for observance out of more than 600 laws, one would in fact be committed to an extremely small fraction of God's total will. The daily reading of the 10 Commandments was canceled right? It was taken out of the daily prayer so that people would not overemphasize their importance. The error we alluded to was directly addressed by the Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishnaic times. Daily repetition of one small portion could be very misleading. Christianity chose to make the Decalogue its important commandments. Judaism, both by theology and by the law, reaffirmed that the 10 are not the whole, they are merely the summary of it. Now, I was always taught about the 10 Commandments being important. I never knew this. But I always knew that Christians thought the 10 Commandments were big ones. I'm like, all right, we agree on something. But only when I learned this before the book was written from Rabbi Blech in his class in 1992 or thereabouts, did I learn that there are no such thing as 10 Commandments, that they're not commandments, that they're utterances, and that those 10 utterances are actually summaries of all 613. I was never taught that before. So we talked earlier about God saying all of the words simultaneously. And now it kind of makes sense. Because why did God say all of the words at once, even though we wouldn't hear them? How could you hear? I can't hear Steve and Jody talking to me at the same time. How could I hear 172 words all being said in one utterance? Well, the reason for that, after going through all of this, is pretty clear. God was actually worried that we might misinterpret it. So before giving us the 10 Commandments, 2 directly and 8 through Moses, in one utterance, God miraculously said all of them. Not because he thought we would be able to understand them or comprehend them, but because now we have a record, at least through the Midrash, through our understanding of how things were brought down, is that all of these 10 Commandments are equal. And they're not commandments, they're categories. And they're all being said at once so that you don't think that the first commandment is more important than the 7th commandment. Why did God put the 10th commandment 10th? Well, obviously it wasn't as important. So God said, no, I'm going to give you all at once, all in the same utterance. God can do that. And then God said, well, I know you can't understand that. So he said to himself, and then the rest were transmitted through Moses. So he comes full circle. God had to make clear that with regard to his law, it's not so. How does one eliminate the erroneous interpretation arising from the limitations of speech, right? You had to say 1 and then 2 and then 3. And God spoke all of these words at once, saying, God said them all together to confirm what would subsequently be the message of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi in the Mishnah. He was the one who transcribed the Mishnah. Be as scrupulous in performing a minor mitzvah, quote-unquote minor mitzvah, as you are with a quote-unquote major one. For you do not know the reward given for mitzvot. We've come full circle. The 10 Commandments seem to suggest a refutation of our principle that all the mitzvot are equal. The 10 concepts or categories, further reduced to one thunderous simultaneous shout of 172 separate words, teach that the Torah, which may subsequently be broken down into many parts, is ultimately and fundamentally just like the author, one. So the 10 Commandments don't exist, but the 10 utterances are basically a summary of all 613 commandments. And we didn't hear all, I always thought we heard all 10 from God, but if you look at the text and you look at the grammar and you look at the numerics, I mean, I said earlier, I'm not a big fan of gematria. I don't think we should learn too much from it. But if the word Torah is 611, there's got to be something. Like, if it were 478 or 830, okay. But 611? Come on. And for the answer to be something as clear in our text that, no, the Torah given by Moses was 611, and it's important to know that the first 2 that relate to I am God, you should have no other God, those had to come from God. So 611 and 2. I think, you know, of all the numerology, and like a lot of it I'm not a big fan of, but how do you, and it's not meant, and let me say it's important, we are not meant to look at numerology as a proof of God's existence or a proof that the Torah is real. Right? It's faith. We have to recognize that it's faith. But at the same time, we can, I think that people here in this class, and I've gotten feedback from the first 2 classes, that people enjoyed learning this material. We can be excited about it. We can't base our faith on the gematria, on the numerics, but part of the fun of learning is to see the same thing from different angles. There's a midrash, there's a tradition, that the 10 Commandments were transcribed, were written, carved into the stone. And that if Moses held up the stone and you were looking at it, you could see the words. But miraculously, if you were standing behind Moses and you saw the other side, right? So here you can see the title of the book, but you can't see, the Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb telling you how great the book is. I have to turn it around, but now you can't see the front. The 10 Commandments were carved that you can see the back from the front and the front from the back. It was miraculous. And as I'm not going to give it away now, but in next week's class, we're going to get into miracles, Jewish miracles and non-Jewish miracles, and what can we learn from miracles. There's so much. I mean, we talk about Passover, right? That God split the sea, and that was pretty much of a sign that the Jews had God behind them and were protecting them. That's a pretty good reason to believe God. If you were there and you saw the sea being split, you would be a believer. And that's why one might think why we're taught that God split the sea for us, because it was a miracle and now we have to believe God. That is as much of a myth as the 10 Commandments being the 10 mitzvot. We are not meant to believe in miracles as a source of our faith, and that'll be the topic of next week's class. Same place, 7:30 Wednesday night.
Are you taking questions?
Yes.
Shall we-
Questions? I'll leave it on. Questions?